Okay, that's gonna do for now. Schnittke's Ninth Symphony, and you just heard the very beginning of it. So the way I was envisioning this is I recognize not many people here actually even know who this composer was, and in my opinion is probably one of the most incredible composers of the 20th century, and is also a very interesting story that connects it with the world of the brain through the prism of the stroke, okay, which I also have some personal connection with through the history of my family. So it sort of brings a lot of my interests together, and you'll see in a little bit why. So if we go to the next slide, okay. So this is a fragment from Schnittke's score. Now, why would somebody who was as accomplished as Schnittke and as incredibly trained write something like this that is virtually impossible to decipher? And the answer to this is that he was very ill, and he has had multiple strokes at that point, either 3 or 4. I'm not quite certain. Minimum is 3, but regardless of what the number was, what it did to him is that he became fully incapable pretty much of doing most things that we do, okay? So he was not really able to talk, he was not able to move much, he was very incapacitated. From what I understand, I haven't met him, I don't think, maybe I met him once as a little child, but I'm not even sure about that. But from what I heard from his widow talk about this, and his widow and my father are friends and have worked on this in the past. I'll come to that. So basically, somebody who has extraordinarily limited ability to use their body faculties, okay, because of the multiple strokes that gradually destroyed a large fraction of their brain. And then to write something like what you just heard, okay, that's the beginning of the Ninth Symphony, but it looked like this, okay? So it looks like really, and then when after multiple iterations it got completed, it got deciphered and produced and performed. I'll talk about that later. It's remarkable to hear that it's really this sophisticated, interesting, beautiful, touching music that comes from something that looks like this. Okay, so if you go to the next slide or hit forward once.
When was this happening?
I'll come to that. It happened 1998, around that time, relatively recently. Okay, so if you look at this and then you hit next slide again, I find it interesting. It's anecdotal, of course. I'm not saying that there is any sort of electroencephalogrammatic recording, but just look at this, look at that. There is, at least at the emotional level, I mean, I'm sure a lot of it is anecdotal, but who knows? The bottom line is that, there is this, I don't even know how to call it, but there is this uniqueness to this, something very refreshing to this story. It's deeply sad, of course, but refreshing in a sense that I almost feel of it as a bit of a tool, to project out what are the parts of the brain, to learn more about the parts of the brain that are musical, because they were clearly spared, right? He was able to write phenomenal music. I'll show you a little bit more about it later. With one addendum, that if you compare Schnittke's style, apparently, and there are books on this too, every time he had a stroke and he came back, his musical style changed. Sometimes subtly, but this symphony, according to experts, is nothing like what he's ever written. In fact, some of the reviews said it's a voice from the other world, and it sounds like music written by somebody who's already dead. Okay, so it's fascinating and sad. Okay, so let's go forward. So that was Schnittke, Dave. Coming back to your question, Schnittke lived in a life that was far too short, in my opinion, but it was incredibly productive. So he died in 1998, and again, from what I understand, before his death, so he wrote this symphonies, 3 movements. Before his death, there was an attempt by Gennady Rождественский, his a friend and the person who conducted all the premieres of his other symphonies, or most of them anyway. He made an attempt to perform this, but there was a lot of uncertainty in some of the passages. And so it was very hard to deconvolute. When Schnittke heard it, said that it was not at all what he meant, and then shortly after that actually passed away. Okay, so jolly beginnings. Next slide. There was Nikolai Karndorf, who was slightly younger contemporary of Schnittke, who Irina Schnittke, the widow of the composer, approached with a request to reconstruct the symphony, to reconstruct what's in there and to make it legible so that it can be made accessible to the public. Okay, and so he said yes, and apparently shortly after that, very shortly after beginning, passed away from a heart attack. Okay, so he was young, and yes, and from what I've heard, he was playing football, the real football, of course. He was also living in Canada, and he was doing that, and I believe, from what I recall, he had a heart attack and died instantaneously. And then Irina Schnittke made another attempt, next slide, by approaching my father, who you see I put in color because other people are dead, so I kind of thought if he sees this slide and maybe doesn't see this and sees all the people in black and white, it may send the wrong message, so I chose to have him in color. By the way, please interrupt. I don't have actually that many slides. I wanted maybe to stimulate this a bit as a discussion because I feel that there is a lot of interesting things that we can learn, or maybe if you could even think of the symphony, as I said, as a tool for completely unique neuroscience experiments. Possibly if you took groups of people who are relatively naive, perhaps, to modern classical music, and put them into MRIs or EEGs and played that music to them to see what are the signatures that you record and what is the brain activity that emerges. I have absolutely no idea what we would learn, but I would be very much happy to bet the $6,000 that I have on my bank account right now, especially because it's a minus, on that we would learn something very interesting. Okay. So that's all I can say.
Where does your father work?
He lives in France, in Orléans. But at the time that this was being done, I remember that was early 2000s, between 2002 and 2004 or something like that. And that was happening in Germany, in Heidelberg. And I even remember some of the specialized gear that my father brought, because my father only sees on one eye and his vision is not very good. So in order to be able to work with that stuff at all, he bought some special magnifying glasses, and it was quite an act of reconstructive vigor of sorts. I remember it was not easy. Also, you can imagine mentally, after knowing that through this symphony was the last thing that two of your fellow composers just saw before they died, that sort of creates a certain somber undertone, I suppose.
So are you saying your father then finished the
Mm-hmm.
job?
Yes.
Okay, and then who played it?
We'll come to that, actually. It's on the next slide. So as you can see, it was successful. I have the recordings here, and if people are interested, I was either going to suggest we can talk more, or I can share a few snippets of, especially, I've been paying attention to what Brian was saying with certain aspects of things like syncopation and competing rhythms and superpositions of rhythms that don't match. So yesterday evening, in company of my two cats, I sat down and selected a couple of pieces of Schnittke to show how he used those elements. So we could do that. We could also, I have the entire recording of this, but you now know that you can get it. You can also, you don't have to actually pay, although of course, who am I to say that? But you can see it on YouTube, and of course I didn't say this. So here you are. That was the first performance in 2007. And another thing that is also interesting is the history of where it was performed, and that is Frauenkirche in Dresden. So, if you go to next slide, this is what Frauenkirche, which is the Church of Women, right, or the Women's Church, looked like. It's in Dresden, beautiful church. The only problem with it was that if you hit the next slide, that in 1945 it looked a bit different. Okay, so it looked a little bit like Schnittke's score. Okay, and then if you go to the next slide, you'll see that it got reconstructed, and this is where they premiered Schnittke's Ninth Symphony, the reconstruction version that my father had done. And I thought it kind of tied a couple of things together very nicely. And so this is, in a way, this is the entire story, at least with this. I look at it more as a scaffolding pieces for a bit of a discussion, I hope, if people find that interesting. This is the first time that I talk about it like this. Obviously, there will be a lot of room for improvement. I think there is a lot of work. I know that this symphony has stimulated a lot of musicologists worldwide to start working on this, to compare it with other symphonies and to see what's the difference in style. But nobody has ever taken it into the world of neuroscience as a tool to understand the human brain a little bit better.